An invisible enemy is systematically dismantling 90% of Iran's oil production, all without a conventional strike being launched.
The first warning did not come from a missile launch. It came from a silence. At 0340 local time, in the northern Persian Gulf, tanker traffic approaching Kharg Island began to slow, then drift, then stop entirely. On radar screens inside Iranian maritime coordination centers, the shipping lanes around the island still looked crowded. 42 loaded and partially loaded supertankers remained scattered across holding patterns south of the terminal approaches. But none of them were moving toward the loading berths anymore. No explosions, no burning ships, no strike packages crossing the coastline, just geometry. And somewhere above the Gulf, invisible in the darkness, a Boeing P-8 Poseidon was already drawing the map that would collapse nearly an entire national oil economy within 9 days. Because Kharg Island was never just another export terminal. That 8-kilometer coral outcrop handled roughly 92% of Iran's crude exports. Nearly every mature oil field in southwestern Iran ultimately depended on a continuous flow through those loading berths. Stop the tankers long enough, and the problem would move backward through the system like pressure through an artery. And that clock had already started. By dawn, Iran's oil ministry understood the danger. The problem was not simply that tankers were refusing to dock. The problem was storage. Kharg's floating roof tank farms could temporarily absorb production interruptions, but only for a limited window. Once the 30 million barrel storage network approached operational limits, upstream production fields would have to slow. And mature reservoirs do not behave like water faucets. Shut them down incorrectly under wartime pressure, and the geology itself starts turning against you. This is where the blockade became something far more dangerous than a naval standoff. Because the United States Navy was not trying to sink Iranian oil exports, it was trying to interrupt timing. And in oil warfare, timing can destroy infrastructure more effectively than bombs. The tactical setup had actually begun days earlier during the broader escalation surrounding Operation Epic Fury. Coalition surveillance assets flooded the Persian Gulf. Electronic intelligence aircraft mapped maritime communications traffic. Satellites tracked tanker congestion patterns around the Strait of Hormuz. But the critical piece was airborne maritime persistence. The P-8 Poseidon changed the entire equation. The aircraft is often described as a submarine hunter, but in this operation, it functioned more like an airborne traffic control system fused with an intelligence platform, flying extended loops across the Gulf. The P-8 integrated surface search radar, electronic support measures, shipping data, infrared imaging, and long-range optical surveillance into a constantly updated maritime picture. Every tanker became a moving node inside a live logistics network. And once coalition planners understood the flow pattern, they identified the pressure point. Kharg Island was physically vulnerable not because it could be bombed, but because its export rhythm was mathematically fragile. VLCCs, very large crude carriers, are not agile vessels. Fully loaded, these ships can displace more than 300,000 tons and require carefully sequenced approach corridors. Turning one around inside congested Gulf traffic is like redirecting a moving skyscraper on ice. Now imagine dozens of them. The coalition did not need to destroy the tankers. It only needed to convince insurers, operators, and captains that the loading cycle around Kharg had become operationally unpredictable. That is exactly what happened. The first layer came from positioning. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers spread across key maritime geometry south of Kharg Island and along transit corridors leading toward the Strait of Hormuz. They did not form a visible wall. They created overlapping uncertainty. Radar coverage, intercept capability, helicopter reach, boarding range. Every captain entering the area now understood that coalition forces could identify, track, challenge, and physically intercept vessels at almost any point in the approach sequence. That matters more than most people realize. Commercial shipping operates on predictability. Tanker economics depend on timing windows measured down to hours. Delays cascade through charter schedules, insurance calculations, crew endurance limits, fuel consumption, and refinery intake commitments. Once uncertainty enters the system, the entire structure begins to fracture. Then came the second layer. VEC teams. Visit, board, search, and seizure. United States Marines and coalition boarding parties began intercepting selected vessels flagged for compliance inspections under wartime maritime enforcement authorities. The boardings were controlled, professional, limited, but the psychological effect spread across the Gulf immediately. Because every tanker captain watching those events understood the real implication. The coalition did not need to board every vessel. It only needed enough boardings to force the rest into hesitation. And hesitation is catastrophic inside a high-volume export terminal. Within 48 hours, anchorage congestion south of Kharg began expanding rapidly. Tankers started holding farther offshore. Some operators delayed entry entirely. Others rerouted towards safer loading schedules elsewhere in the region. That was the moment the invisible countdown became visible. Inside the Kharg storage system, floating roof tanks were filling faster than crude could leave. Floating roof tanks are engineering solutions designed to reduce vapor buildup inside massive crude storage facilities. Instead of leaving empty airspace above the oil, the roof physically rises and falls with the liquid level. It is an elegant design. Efficient. Stable. Until throughput collapses. Because these systems are designed around continuous movement, once storage approaches operational maximums, pressure begins propagating backward through separator stations, gathering systems, transfer pipelines, and eventually into the reservoirs themselves. And this is where most people got the story wrong. The blockade was never primarily about exports. It was about reservoir integrity. Iran's mature oil fields in Khuzestan depend on carefully managed pressure balances developed across decades of production. Many fields already operate under declining natural pressure conditions. Engineers compensate using water injection systems, gas management strategies, and tightly controlled extraction sequencing. Under normal conditions, shutting wells is already complicated. Under sudden wartime export paralysis, it becomes a geological nightmare. Because reservoirs are not empty underground caves filled with oil. They are porous rock systems under pressure equilibrium. Think of a giant stone sponge buried kilometers underground, saturated with hydrocarbons, gas, salt water, and pressure gradients accumulated over geological time. Pull oil too aggressively and pressure collapses. Shut production incorrectly, and water intrusion can permanently contaminate extraction zones. And Iran was running out of time to prevent exactly that. By day 3, production throttling had already begun. The problem was simple, but brutal. Crude continued flowing from upstream fields towards storage infrastructure that no longer had sufficient export clearance. Every hour without tanker throughput tightened the pressure inside the system. Iranian operators now faced an impossible choice: continue producing and risk tank farm overflow, or rapidly shut down mature fields and risk permanent reservoir damage. Neither option was survivable. Meanwhile, the maritime blockade tightened without firing a shot. P-8 patrol cycles expanded farther south into Gulf transit corridors. Coalition surface combatants refined intercept geometry. Maritime helicopters extended visual identification ranges. Electronic monitoring intensified around tanker communications traffic. And crucially, the coalition avoided the one thing Iran expected: no kinetic strike. That restraint mattered enormously, because without missile attacks or naval bombardment, global shipping insurers faced a legal and commercial gray zone rather than a clean wartime event classification. The danger was operational ambiguity. Ambiguity terrifies shipping markets. A missile strike creates a visible crisis. Unpredictable boarding patterns, uncertain inspection delays, and constantly shifting maritime enforcement zones create something worse: unquantifiable risk. And unquantifiable risk causes commercial systems to freeze. By the middle of the first week, tanker availability around Kharg collapsed. The loading cycle had effectively broken. Some VLCC operators calculated that entering the area risked indefinite delay windows measured in days rather than hours. Others feared seizure complications, insurance disputes, or inability to exit the Gulf under tightening maritime control. The result was a traffic jam stretching across the northern Gulf. and deep inside Iran's oil fields, the consequences were becoming irreversible. One of the least understood aspects of oil production is how dependent mature reservoirs become on continuity. Stopping production sounds simple. Close the valves. Pause extraction. Reality is much uglier. As pressure dynamics destabilize, water coning can begin accelerating through production zones. Water coning occurs when water underlying an oil reservoir rises upward toward the production well due to altered pressure gradients. Imagine drinking from the top layer of oil, floating above water, through a straw. Pull too hard or interrupt the balance incorrectly, and the water beneath starts rising into the extraction path. Once that happens at scale,